Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hopefully you can hear me. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, board member for ColumbiaDC and a graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. Thanks for joining this evening. We are very privileged to have Stephanie B. Preston, professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, with us to talk about altruism, which is the topic of her most recent book with Columbia University Press, The Altruistic Urge, Why We Are Driven to Help Others. The link to the book is on our website. We will share it again with the recording of this event, which is, just to confirm, is being recorded and will be shared within 24 hours. Please allow me to briefly introduce our speaker. Dr. Preston is a professor of psychology and director of the Ecological Neuroscience Lab at the University of Michigan. She has an MA and Ph.D. in behavioral neuroscience from UC Berkeley, where she studied mechanisms of decision-making in food-storing animals. One line of her research looks at the mechanisms of empathy and altruism, focusing on perception-action mechanisms for feeling others' state and the impact of evolved caregiving mechanisms on altruism. Another line of Dr. Preston's work examines mechanisms for making decisions about resources, particularly how people decide to acquire and discard material goods. And also, the study includes issues such as consumption, consumerism, compulsive hoarding, and pro-environmental behavior.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great opportunity and a pleasure to be here. My parents were actually alums from Columbia, and they lived in the DC area for 40 years or more. So it's really a pleasure to be able to speak with you today. I'm going to share my screen. So this talk is about my book, The Altruistic Urge, Why We're Driven to Help Others. I first always want to give my acknowledgements, because you don't want to run late on time and save it for the end and then leave people out. There's so many people in my lab who have participated in this research, all the students pictured here, and some of the faculty are my collaborators. And in the bottom right is my advisor, Lucy Jacobs from Berkeley, where I studied behavioral neuroscience. And the top left is my husband, who also spends a lot of time talking to me about these ideas at home and helping me with things. I have a little bit of an unusual background. As you mentioned, my undergraduate degree was in cognitive science. And then I went on to study what they call neuroethology, which is sort of the way that the brain evolves and species adapt to environments in order to improve success. So these are all pictures of animals that I've studied. There's a monogamous vole on the top left, a kangaroo rat on the right top, a squirrel, and those are food storing animals, kangaroo rats and squirrels, obviously, and the macaque monkeys in the middle there on the right, and chimpanzees below that. And in all of these cases, I was interested in not just the behavior of the animal, which I am very interested in, of course, but also how the brain is similar across species in order to support important behaviors for their survival. So the overarching goal of my research is always to improve human health and wellness, and to understand how humans work in a big picture way in order to be able to provide suggestions and improvements for how we can best adapt our own behavior to our environment and live happy, productive lives. So I'm going to divide this into sort of 3 mini stories, and then the relevance of the stories to one another until my research will be more clear after the stories, and then I'll talk about experiments from my own lab. The first is what we call the subway Superman. This is Wesley Autry, and if you might have even been living in New York City when this happened in 2007. He saw a boy, a young man, suffer from a seizure. Everybody on the platform sort of observed this event happen to the boy. And then subsequent to his seizure, he fell into the subway train tracks. And an oncoming car was imminent, and people had to very quickly decide what they were going to do. And Wesley Autry had some special expertise in kind of union work in really small enclosed spaces. And he was there with his daughters on the platform. And even though it was, you know, death-defying, he jumped into the train track, and there was no time to lift the boy out, and he knew that. And so he laid on top of him in the middle of the tracks so that the train would pass over them and they could both survive. Let's see if we can get this video to work.
On the New York City subway, it's hard enough finding someone who will give up his seat to a stranger, let alone be willing to give up his life for one.
The train was coming in like that.
It happened just 50-year-old Wesley Autry, a construction worker and Navy veteran, was standing on a subway platform with his two little girls when right in front of them, a man started having a seizure.
He kind of stumbled and over his own feet and fall backwards. I see a train coming, but the train is so close, I'm like, what do I do?
Wesley jumped onto the tracks and thought if he could just lie on top of the man, keep him from flailing, maybe the train would roll right over both of them. The clearance was exactly 21 inches. Wesley and the man, 20 and a half.
No way the train can stop before this gentleman could get him up off the tracks. So he covered him with his body and pushed him down to a point where the train wouldn't hit his head, and held him down under the tracks while the train came and rolled right over the top of him.
It gave Wesley's children the scare of their young lives.
I thought he was going to get killed.
And Wesley, the scare of his, too.
I'm like talking to him, sir, you can't move. I got two kids up here looking for the father to come back. I don't know you, you don't know me, but listen, don't panic. You know, I'm here to save you.
As for the guy Wesley saved, he's 20-year-old Cameron Hollipter. And other than a few scrapes and bruises, his father says he's doing fine.
Mr. Autry's instinctive and unselfish act saved our son's life.
You know, the word hero gets thrown around a lot nowadays.
What a better way to say to start off the new year than to save a life.
Hero man! Nice to be reminded of what one really looks like. Steve Hartman, CBS News, New York.
Okay. And there's an image that they have from the newspaper where they show how the clearance under the track was really just a half an inch to spare. And somehow he, was able to apply his expertise and his, generous heart to save him and make a really quick, immediate decision. And we'll circle back to this. And in the second story, I read an article a long time ago about the assiduous dams, and you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. So in 1969, William Wollstonecraft did a study to understand how mammals and mothers, and then in this case, dams are maternal rats, how they know to take care of their pups, their offspring. So shortly after birth, there's this extensive amount of care for the offspring of rodents, and they wanted to figure out how in the hormones and in the brain, this shift from being not a caregiving animal to a very strongly caregiving animal takes place. So what they did was they had this apparatus with two cages that were connected, and one cage had a chute coming in with one of those conditioning bars you've seen maybe on TV or in a class, where the rat pushes the bar and something comes down the chute as the sort of reward. And then there's a nest chamber in an adjacent box. So what happens is they put a food item down the chute after the rat pushes the bar. It's a delicious reward. Then they put one of the new dam's own pups, one of her own offspring that she recently gave birth to, down the chute. And the poor helpless pup is not used to being alone and separated like that from the mom and from the nest. So she carries the offspring over to the nest in the adjacent chamber, and then she comes back to press the bar to see what will come out. And after a few of her own pups are sent down the chute and she carries them all back into the nest, then they start putting the pups of other dams. So offspring that are not related to her come down the chute one at a time. And just as willingly, she picks them up and brings them to her nest. And then what the experimenters do is, because there's a limited supply of these unrelated pups, they kind of steal them out of the nest and then bring them back around to the top of the chute and deliver them again. And she continues to pull them from this chamber back into the nest chamber. And the experimenters are waiting to see how, not only will she retrieve the pups that are not her own, but how long will it take for her to get habituated to this and stop doing the act? So in this graph, you can see 3 hours long on the x-axis and how many times they retrieve the pup on the y-axis. And so over 3 hours, the dams continued to retrieve the pups. They did not tire or, get bored. They just continued to circle back around and around and around for 3 hours. And the experimenters actually said, which is rare, that they themselves terminated the experiment because they got too tired of waiting for the dams to give up. So as a consequence of this type of research, more recently, they have figured out the exact neural mechanisms in the brain for how these dams come to care for their pups. So during pregnancy, all of these hormones are released. There become changes in the brain and oxytocin receptors. And then this neural system shifts from an avoidance route on the bottom into an approach route on the top. So normally, if you just put a young pup into a cage of a rat or a vole, they might not take care of it, at least not right away. But as soon as these hormones are on board and the oxytocin is upregulated and things like that, then they shift into immediately caring for the offspring, even if it's not their own. And so there's this neural distinction that they know a lot about at this point from research with rodents that is responsible for this important shift into becoming a caregiving animal. And it's important to point out that this is not just for females. Also, males will take care of pups using these same shifts in the brain and inspired by these same changes in hormones that influence these neural circuits. So it's not just for females, and it's not just for dams. If you apply these hormones or make these changes in the brain to unmated rodents, they will also immediately care for pups. And if you just leave an adult in the compartment with a strange pup for days and days, they will shift naturally from being avoidant to approaching and caring for the pup, even if it's not their own. So this is a powerful system. And we also have research in other species, including humans, showing that these same neural systems and neurohormones are responsible for this shift into caregiving in human mothers and even human fathers, along with many other species that they've tested, including monkeys and sheep and birds even. Speaking of birds, the third story has to do with Konrad Lorenz. And I don't know if you've heard of him. He was one of the first ethologists to study animal behavior in the wild. This is a picture of him. And sometimes people have heard of him because this phenomenon of, imprinting to the mother and immediately following them after birth is something that he discovered. And there's amusing videos and documentaries about the birds and the gray-eyed geese that actually imprinted to him and began following him around on his farm. So that might be familiar to you. And it's a good time of year to discuss this because the geese have just given birth in my town, and they are being actively protected from the cars along the road and the people near the river where I live. So another behavior that he studied during this process of caring for offspring was what they call an egg rolling behavior. So normally the geese sit on their eggs in the nest, and then if the egg for some reason becomes separated from the nest and it's outside of the nest, they have this stereotyped behavior where they stick out their neck, and they roll the egg back into the nest, and so that they can keep it warm and safe underneath them in the nest. And this is what fixed behavior, they call it a fixed action pattern, because they will do it to any roundish object that's outside of the nest. It doesn't actually have to be their own egg, because of the way the brain and body evolved to take care of these eggs. So the neural circuit is not specifying the exact object. It's just specifying that when something roundish rolls out of the nest and is nearby, we should do this behavior and pull it back into the nest, which ensures that they can protect and keep safe their eggs. So what is common across these? Why am I interested in these three cases, and why do they serve as sort of a foundation for my research and theory? So they all involve assistance or aid to somebody who needs to be rescued, who's vulnerable, and has to be quickly saved. It's not something where you can sit around and think about it and decide what you want to do and make a pros and cons list and discuss the options with your partner. It's a fast action that's required. And the individuals are more likely to perform the act if they have some sort of preparation or expertise for the act that's necessary in the moment. And it doesn't require what we consider cognitive deliberation or perspective taking. So a lot of times when you ask people how they decide to help another individual, they rely very strongly on these cognitive explicit thoughts. So I decide explicitly who I'm going to help and when and why and how much help I'm going to give them and whether they deserve it or not. And all these thoughts are going through my head. And people do make decisions that way sometimes. But this particular neural circuit is designed to foster an immediate urge to respond. That's why we call it the altruistic urge. So because of this, I tied these themes together into what I call the altruistic response model, which is what is described in the book. And I take this same neural circuit on the bottom right side that's from the rodent literature and that we know also exists in humans. And then I expanded it to include the things in the circle that are brain areas in humans and in the frontal lobe that we know interact with these other brain areas. So I created this larger neural circuit to explain the ways in which your brains process decisions to help somebody in urgent need. And the altruistic response isn't all kinds of altruism. It's this very specific kind, right? So altruism can be many different things. Even amoeba can perform altruism and fungi can perform altruism. So we're not talking about all kinds of altruism. It's a kind of altruism that they call helping, but it's also this subset that is this active response, this urge, this motivation to approach and retrieve and help somebody who has these qualities like an infant. So this approach avoidance circuit that you take from the rodents is actually very applicable to human behavior, because we know that people are both very altruistic, but also embarrassingly apathetic. So most of the research in the 50s and 60s on altruism in the 20th century was in response to genocide in Europe and the Holocaust. And they wanted to know, why are people standing by and doing nothing? Why don't they say anything? Why did it take us so long to engage and help in this case? So they call that bystander apathy. And another famous case is from Kitty Genovese, and they have some really interesting movies and documentaries recently about her case, where she was stabbed behind her apartment in sort of an alley in the middle of the night by a previous boyfriend who was sort of a maniac. And many people in the apartment complex heard something because she was screaming for help. But maybe one person called the police. There are debates about the degree to which people were ignoring the sound or knew what it was. But it was taken as an example of, city blight and the way in which our personal relationships and the way in which we interact and help one another breaks down during city life. Whether or not that's true is now being debated. But nonetheless, we have a lot of cases in human behavior where people avoid responding. But on the other hand, people spend years, if not decades, giving very intense protective care of their offspring. And also in heroism, people seem to jump into rushing waters and burning buildings without a care for their life, when it seems so dangerous that, if you did have an ability to make a decision and make a pros and cons list, you would definitely say con, this is not a good idea because I could surely be killed. But people still do make this decision, on a regular level. So let's talk about these really good questions as we go on. I think it will come up as we go on, but let's circle back if I haven't addressed them by the end. So what I do is I describe how this brain system explains both maternal care, heroism, and bystander apathy as all part of this emergent, evolved system. And in this case, I have sort of my own flow chart that I've made of when people do act. And these are not all or none responses, they're additive. So the more of these attributes you have on board, the more similar the situation is to caring for a new helpless offspring, the more likely people feel this urge to respond. So the victim is usually what they say neotenous, and neotenous means possessing features that are infant-like. So, infants they're small, they have these rounded features, small limbs, large heads, big eyes relative to their face, short noses. So they have these attributes that make them cute, that make them lovable, that make us want to approach and hold them, that also potentiate the likelihood you'll want to respond. And this has been shown in adults also. They're vulnerable, they're more likely to be bonded to the individual who helps. The victim is usually in distress and in need of immediate aid, not down the line, not something you consider and work on later. And the observer usually has some form of expertise in which they know what the proper response is going to be. They think their response is possible. They know what to do. They think it will work out and be successful. And then there's this response. So this differs from a lot of other theories of altruism because, for one, it differs from this conscious deliberative process that somebody asked about in the Q&A, which can pull from some features of this system, like your motivation to help a vulnerable, distressed victim can inform a conscious decision to act. But you can also have this strong motivation in the absence of explicit thought. So the motivation can be there and promote your likelihood of doing some conscious long-term decision to help. But it also can promote an immediate response that really has very little conscious appraisal with it. And so my emphasis on the observer having the expertise and predicting success is important, because if you're scared, if you don't swim well, if you don't think you can carry a body out of a burning building or a train track, your brain doesn't immediately predict success, and you'll be one of these apathetic bystanders, which isn't always a good idea. And so this is all predicated on the assumption that our brains are similar across species. So the way that a rat helps a pup wouldn't be relevant to human altruism unless our brains were actually similar. And on the left of this image, you see a rodent brain with some of the areas in the neural circuit highlighted. And on the right, you have a human brain, and they obviously look very different. So here's sort of like a to scale drawing of what a human brain would look like: a rat or mouse on the top left and a songbird on the top right. And so the size of the human brain is obviously much bigger, but our body size is also much bigger. So you have to always control for body size when you think about brain size. And even though a rat or mouse brain is only, like as big as the tip of your thumb, let's say, and even smaller in a infant rodent, it actually has the same brain areas. So the way in which, let's say, the nucleus accumbens, which processes, rewards and dopamine and oxytocin, can promote behavior and approach toward desirable things, including infants and including drugs of abuse and including romantic partners and even really beautiful shoes. We have these rewards that drive us toward things we think are pleasurable and valued. And this system works very similarly across species, even though the brains look very different. And here's a similar example of the two brains of a bird on the left, a songbird, and a human on the right. And again, they look very different. And the relative proportion of brain areas is different. So for example, birds have a very large cerebellum, which is like your spatial motor area in the very back bottom of your brain. But they have a very large one because they spend so much of their time navigating and moving in space in these complex ways. But they have a thalamus, just like we have a thalamus. They have a midbrain, just like we have a midbrain. They have a striatum. They have an amygdaloid complex, which is equivalent to our amygdala. They have a hippocampus equivalent to ours. So they have all of these regions, and they even have a hormone very similar to oxytocin called mesotocin, which is also used during offspring care. So people want to believe that humans are special, and we surely have our own unique attributes, but so many of our evolved neural processes that are key for survival are actually shared even in the brain. And somebody had asked in the Q&A about oxytocin enhancing empathy, but also racism. And that's actually true. So as I mentioned earlier, the degree to which you're bonded with the other and familiar with them is one of the potentiators of this response. So obviously you're more likely to save your own, child, your own kin, your best friend, like these, you have this love for another, which is like the compassion that you might feel that Heather Jacobs asked about. You have these compassionate, sympathetic love and bonding feelings toward another individual. And because that changes your actual hormones, then you're more likely to help those individuals than strangers, which is why people think heroism and altruism is so amazing, because you would do it towards somebody that's a complete stranger, right? Why would we do that? But it's considered that this race effect is due to the degree that we evolved for in-group care and protection. So it's considered race as the important in-group, out-group in America, because we have this strong and problematic divide between white and Black individuals and the way that they're treated. And so the white and the Black people consider the people of their own race, let's say, as their in-group, and then the other race as an out-group. And then oxytocin has this way of fostering compassion for the in-group. And but negative consequences can result as well, as they imply in their response. So this is an image also from Konrad Lorenz showing you this idea of neoteny. So it's not just human babies that have these funny features that make them so cute. It's also rabbits and dogs and birds that have these shortened and rounded features that he believes make them more attractive and make you want to approach and care for them in a way that can be even extended to adults. So they make experiments where they take pictures of human faces and they morph them to be rounder or, foreshortened, and people want to help and they find those individuals more attractive even as adults. It's also predicated on the idea that our emotional resonance with others is shared across species. So my prior work on empathy was about the degree to which you can feel the emotion that you observe in another person. So in the top left, there's a really cute picture of a happy baby and a happy parent, presumably. And it just makes me happy and like warms my cockles just to see the picture. And I don't even know these people, and it's just a static image, right? So we measure things like the way your face muscles mimic the face muscles of people you observe, the way that your brain uses the same areas to feel your own emotions and to understand other people's emotions, which we think of as the way you empathize with others. And it's part of this way in which we can experience compassion, because in order to understand and feel for other people and to want to help them, you have to have this really intuitive, embodied experience of what their distress is like. And this is something that they also show in rodents, getting back to our theme of what we call homology and homologous brains. So rats also do this behavior where if they see another rat in pain, it activates and upregulates their own pain system, and it can promote aid. So this is one particular interesting experiment where one rat is trapped in a tube and is distressed, and the observing rodent will manipulate the tube for a long period of time until they can figure out how to open it and release the other rat. And similar to the person who mentioned in-group, out-group with oxytocin before, you will help a rodent individual that's not familiar to you or not from your tribe, let's say your species, but you're more likely, and the response is faster and more sustained if you already know the individual, like from your cage cohort, or they look similar to you. And they'll even do this if there's rewards available. They have one study where they have like Hershey's Kisses in the cage, and they'll go to help the other rodent get out of the cage that they're trapped in before they even go and try and get the chocolate. So does this theory stand up to empirical testing? This is, as a scientist, you don't really want to just come up with fanciful theories. You have to be able to test them in the lab or in the field, in the real world, and see if it plays out the way you expect it to. So we've done this in a variety of different ways, some in the lab and some with nonprofit organizations or companies. So one way to study altruism is with charitable donation. And charitable donation isn't quite like heroism because you're not diving into the water to save somebody, but it's pretty hard to study that in the lab. So we use charitable donation as like a proxy for this urge to help others and to try and test the theory. And in that way, it's a strong test of the theory because there's no reason you need to have some of these processes in place to donate money. So we do show when you have different descriptions of charities, let's say in one charity, the organization is leaping into the water to pull out boaters who have fallen in. And in another case, they're taking care of children at the hospital. In another case, that's funny for Washington, D.C. members, they want to save the Constitution. Right? So are you going to donate for the preservation of the Constitution? And people are actually not too keen on that, it turns out. And like specific to the theory, people are more likely to help if the description of the charity sounds active and immediate. So when it sounds like there's an urgent, immediate response that's physical to the victim in distress, they're more likely to give money. And women always give more money than males. We find this in virtually every study we've done. And time will tell if that's because this caregiving instinct is evolved through maternal care, at least in our species and some other mammals, or it could be a cultural effect. We don't know that. You know, women are also socialized to seem more caring and kind. So we are not able to change that right now. Test that right now. So in an fMRI study, that's a functional magnetic resonance imaging, in the brain scanner, we show people these different charities, and we actually manipulate the descriptions of the charities, but the subjects don't know that, to either sound preparatory and nurturant, or an immediate physical response that's nurturant, or it's preparatory, like it's some background work you do for a later time, but it's for a heroic cause, or it's an immediate heroic problem, like the canonical or stereotyped heroic act. So, they sort of like go down the system, and the immediate heroic one is the most like what you think would resemble like a pup retrieval. And so people see these trials where they see a description of a charity, they rest for a few minutes, they earn money by pressing buttons in the scanner, and then they decide how many of these tokens they want to donate to the charity. And this graph maybe looks complicated, but it's kind of easy to see. The pink is higher than the blue, which means that neonates, children, babies, even teenagers are more likely to receive money than charities that help adults. And there's a slant because people are more likely to help when the problem is immediate or when it's heroic. So this immediate heroic response, especially when it helps children, is something that really drives people's aid. And here's another version of this where you see the amount of money that you give to children and babies is above the pink line, is distinct from how much you want to give to an adult. And usually people give more when it's an immediate problem. But there's a kind of interesting confound where it's very hard to describe a charity that helps babies and children that doesn't feel nurturant, because it naturally evokes this sense of care and this compassion that we heard about earlier. So you can't quite deconfound those. And you can represent this by a number, a single number that's like the three-way interaction between nurturing an active, immediate case, of a baby or child. And then you can detect where in the brain is more active, or where do you have more cells, more gray matter cells, more densely packed, depending on how strong you feel this urge to help infants who need immediate nurturant care. And it doesn't really matter if you know much about the brain, but these areas on the top, it says like SMA, PMD, these are sort of on the top of the area where your motor strip and your cognitive areas meet. So you have these sort of motor preparation responses in your brain that are mediated in these areas. That is a novel response in science, because so many studies are on the way I feel your own pain, and I might have compassion or want to help. But in this case, because of the immediate heroic aspect, we can demonstrate it really relies on this physical motor preparation, even when it's only a charity and it's really not a physical response. We also did some consulting with St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. And I went for a visit there, and I saw the facility, which is amazing and wonderful. And they treat children with cancer for free, including housing the parents who can be near their child during treatment. It's just amazing. And I gave a talk about the research and when people are more likely to help. And I consulted with the media team, and they were able to make some alterations to the ads to increase donations. And in the most promising case, they have a Spanish-speaking ad, and they put in this physical image of actually texting the donation to the organization, and the donations went up an incredible amount, like 17% or something like that. And we've also done some work with the Environmental Defense Fund. So if you want people to help others, and you know it works with people, is it going to also work with things that are also vulnerable and require our aid, but are not people? In this case, the natural environment. So my theory was that this Earth, save the Earth, planet Earth, is undermining people's urge to respond, because an Earth is really not at all like a helpless infant. So if the immediacy of response is driven by it seeming more like a helpless infant, then constantly showing the Earth isn't a good idea, because we studied people's associations with the Earth. And as I suspected, people think of the Earth as big, powerful, resilient, timeless, versatile, and helping us, like a nurturer of us, like Mother Earth helps us. We don't help Mother Earth. And people rarely mention the earth is fragile, endangered, or unhealthy. So the things in red are like demotivating, and they're very commonly thought of with the earth itself. So what we did is we divided all these ways in which people conceptualize the earth into themes. Gaia, planet, being hostile, nature, climate change and warming, providing energy, being resilient, harvesting. So we showed people these different collage images, and we didn't give them the name of the theme. We just showed them the images. So they're just to think about the image and what it inspires in their own mind and what they think about it. And there was all these different types of images related to the earth that I listed earlier. And two concepts stood out to me. One of them was called the vulnerable earth concept. And those are when people do actually think of the earth as at risk, vulnerable, fragile, needing our help, being distressed, the resources are depletable. And when we use it, there's a cost to our use. But not everybody holds this concept to the same degree. So people are more likely to see the earth as vulnerable if they're politically liberal, they report being an environmentalist, they have a higher childhood SES, they're less likely to be religious, and they have higher empathy for other people based on their self-report. And in contrast to this, there's this impassive earth concept. And I call it impassive because when they see images of the earth's destruction, global warming, an oil spill on fire in the Gulf, the effects of an earthquake, they feel less emotionally bad about it. So it's not that they don't understand the concept, it just doesn't make them as upset as it makes other people. This is more common in political conservatives, males, people in rural environments, people are less environmentalist, more traditional religious practice, and lower empathy for other people based on just the self-report. So I'm interested in this because, as you know, in America, we have a strong political divide that makes it hard to get people to want to help the earth. And it turns out there's a lot of ways in which you're like, well, why are people impassive to the earth's destruction? If we want everybody to help, then we better find a way to describe the earth's problems in ways that they will find appealing. So what does it mean to be impassive? And we actually did a many study sequence that will be published soon. It's accepted for publication, where we measured their emotional response to all kinds of things, not having to do with the earth. So crying babies, wounded police officers, injured athletes, disgusting moldy food, and even positive things. Happy babies, chocolate bars, ice cream sundaes, piles of money, right? So you can measure people's emotional response to all these things. And it turns out that the people who report being more impassive to the earth's destruction, they're just less emotional in general across the board. And it doesn't just have to do with negative things. It also has to do with positive things. They feel less bad for distressed people. They're less likely to be environmentalists. But it's not about the earth per se. They're just less emotional. They're less expressive in daily life of emotions. So we tried to make ads that would appeal to everybody. I'm going to wrap up my talk here in a second and talk about the questions. So we made different ads to try to appeal to people who did or did not already see the earth as vulnerable. And we were actually able to succeed in the idea that more conservative individuals did like ads we made to talk about God's great, beautiful earth more than the vulnerability of like polar bears on an ice floe. So they liked the ads we made more, and they liked the ads more than real ads from the World Wildlife Foundation. And there are more wanting to share these ads on social media, like on Facebook, where you could just retweet something on Twitter, for example. But interestingly, people donated more money, no matter which group they were in, conservative or liberal, if they were to understand the earth as vulnerable. So when you pull out the immediate need of a vulnerable earth or species, they're more likely to help. And we did studies of monarch butterflies, and it has this similar theme in which people are very engaged in helping monarch butterflies, but especially if they have this familiarity and contact with butterflies, they watch them grow from the pupae to caterpillars into beautiful butterflies. If they witness this process, they witness their awesome migration, they're more likely to want to plant gardens and donate money. And we study why people want to help different kinds of species. And would you rather help a person or an animal, a kitten or a refugee? Like, we have all these different images we show people. And there are themes that support the theory, but they're slightly different depending on if it's a wild animal or a domestic animal. So people want to help familiar individuals, again, getting back to this in-group familiarity that we talked about with the oxytocin. So if they're familiar and the individual clearly seems to need help, which is part of the theory, then they want to give aid. And if it's cute, they want to give aid, which is like the idea from the altruistic response. But between wild and domestic animals, it's more important for a wild animal to be beautiful or like amazing and powerful than it is for a domestic animal, which is more likely to be cute. You know, so like a cat or a dog is cute, or a kitten or a bunny is cute, but an elephant or a giraffe might need your help and is beautiful and amazing and awesome in this slightly different way. And I did some studies with the Hyundai company to understand the way in which the shape of a car, being more neotenous, rounded, and you know, with sort of like eyes in the front or like a smiling grille, can impact people's liking of vehicles. And just as you would suspect, you know, men and women have different perceptions of these cute vehicles versus really big, powerful looking ones. And smiling cars seem really pleasant, but actually they seem less safe because they're not protecting us, right? We're more protecting them. So there's a method to the madness where we do a lot of different kinds of work in our lab, but the book describes and lays out this theory in which there's caregiving social mammals that have these neural and emotional processes that are shared over millennia and across species that are built in to promote bonding and protection of the most vulnerable individuals, that are promoted by empathy and states like compassion, and that are motivated by stimuli that are like an infant, you know, either physically or conceptually have features in common with poor, helpless, adorable infants. And you can make these approach or avoidance decisions very quickly and implicitly because it's baked into this neural system that we share with species that aren't thought to have a lot of cognitive deliberative processes. And if you understand this, you understand how the brain works. And when it's most powerfully driven, you can actually increase aid to people in the real world. So if you want to know more, you can get the book on Amazon, or they have it at some local bookstores. My local bookstore, Literati, has it. My local Barnes & Noble has it, but I'm not sure if it's in all Barnes & Nobles, but you're welcome to suggest to them that they should carry it. And you can get it online. It's available in an audio version, in a digital version, and in a physical copy. So there's lots of different ways to enjoy. And then we can talk about your questions and answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, if I may call you Stephanie. I just want to mention that we have provided a link to the book through, obviously Amazon sells the book, but our link is through Columbia University Press, and there is a discount code for 20% off of the price. So I think eventually they all converge into Amazon price. So just want to mention that.
Oh, awesome. That's great.
Right.
Thanks.
All right. Well, I just want to also remind people that they can continue to put their questions in the Q&A box, and we would respond to as many of them until the time runs out. So let's just start with the first question I have, and you may have answered this. And the question is from Heather Jacobs. Is there any research that offspring care system connects with the idea of compassion?
Certainly it does. So the feeling states you get from things like oxytocin and bonding with the other individual promote both, active care and compassion. But compassion is thought of as a more sustained state that doesn't need to be acute in the moment. So one interesting thing about the altruistic urge, as I call it, is you can, I'm going to stop screen sharing if you don't mind. One interesting thing about the altruistic urge is that you can have this immediate thought, and then later you ask people, what were you thinking at the time? And they say, like, I wasn't thinking anything. I just like leapt in, I just felt like it had to be done. So compassion is thought of as like this more sustained state, related to what the next person was asking about deliberate processing and these implicit processes. So for example, you can save somebody from icy waters, which we have a lot of in Michigan. And if you're a long-lived resident of Washington, D.C., you might remember when a plane crashed into the bridge in a winter day and people had to be rescued literally from the icy water. That was a very salient time if you were in D.C. then. So that happens with this urgent response. And you could help a couple people at a time in that way, right? But if you're deliberating about your care, you might be able to use your motivation to help distressed individuals to help many more people, right? So my grandmother, for example, donated money to the St. Jude's Hospital, and so many children can benefit from that decision that she made very deliberately. So people refer to that sometimes as the effective altruism movement, where you try to be more thoughtful about where you send your aid so that the most people can help. So things like refugee crises and political strife, like in Ukraine right now, those are examples where you can really think about how you want to act and where you want to place your money. But there's still this urge, because of the images you see on TV and the stories you hear of people being separated and walking hundreds of miles to a border, these images activate our emotional system, which then feed into this longer term decision to help. We did talk about the oxytocin, and it is unfortunately all of our empathy, including the degree to which you feel others' physical pain, is different for in-group and out-group, and we're going to have to find a way around that. That's going to be one of the most important things in research going forward, is to figure out how to undermine this natural cognitive system that divides people into similar to me and not like me, which is actually very important. And somebody asked about regret. Do you act altruistically because you don't want to deal with regret? So that's, again, one of those things that's reflected in your cognitive conscious deliberation. So I think in the moment of urgent aid, you're not really having time to think through all of those different implications. But as soon as you sit back and try to decide, well, my neighbor wants me to watch their cat for a month while they go out of town. That's actually kind of a big burden. Do I want to do that? And you have time to sit around and think about if you want to do it. And, the regret of feeling bad or looking bad to others or feeling like a bad person can be part of that longer deliberated process. But the converse of that is what economists call the warm glow of giving. So when you imagine helping, you think how good you'll feel if you do help, and this warm glow that you're going to experience imagining like how great it felt to help another person, and that feeds into your decision, and you also feel it on the back end after you give the aid. So there's sort of like two sides of the coin of regret and joy from giving. Somebody was asking about how altruism can be trained. Oh, wait, I want to make sure I didn't skip one. Oh, there's the alpha beta animals. So there's interesting division of research on this. Is a more dominant individual likely to help, or a more subordinate individual? And we just talked about this actually in my class. Where
maybe sorry, Dr. Stephanie, maybe repeat the. I would like to repeat the question. The question is, there's a social position. You're talking about social animals, and I don't know if altruism is just particular to social animals, but let's assume if it is. is the social position, for example, being an alpha, beta, does make any difference in their altruism and how they realize it or show it?
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of research on this dominance, especially in monkeys and apes and dogs. So a lot of people are familiar with this concept of like dominance and subordinates. And even in our own lives, we know that, you know, like our bosses are dominant to us, and, you know, our children might be subordinate to us. And in this hierarchy, humans are less hierarchical than animals like, let's say, macaque monkeys, but we still have hierarchies in our own lives, for good or bad. And there's actually mixed research on this, because on the one hand, a dominant individual feels more in control, more powerful, and more capable. So in that regard, if you remember this flow chart at the very bottom, there had to be this expertise that you had to predict you could help and succeed. And a dominant individual is also less likely to fear retribution. So if a dominant monkey wants to provide aid to a distressed monkey, they don't have to worry about a more dominant individual beating them up because they thought that was a bad idea, right? But a subordinate individual literally does have to worry about being attacked as a result of trying to reach out to help somebody more subordinate. So dominance has a lot of benefits in that regard. So bystander apathy is going to be lower because it reduces the cost of helping and increases the possibility of knowing what to do and being able to do it. But on the other hand, there's some research showing that people who feel more subordinate are more likely to help because they want to engender themselves into others' good graces, right? So like in monkeys, they say like grooming goes up the hierarchy. So I groom the individual that's above me in the hierarchy, and so on and so forth, all the way up until you're the top of the chain, the alpha, who just sits there and gets groomed all day long. It doesn't have to groom anybody else, right? And so the same goes for altruistic aid. Like a dominant doesn't have a need to improve good graces. So in that deliberated decision-making, you might see more from more subordinate individuals or people who feel like they'd like to increase their power.
And maybe that leads to this question. There's a difference in your opinion, and I don't know if there is a value in altruism, but if it's something is deliberate, you know, slow brain, calculated altruism, and something that somebody does automatically, and maybe not even conscious about it, is there a value with difference between them?
Yeah, I think I talked about this in the sense of which people's heroism is more likely to be valued in these quick responses, but people's reach of how many people they can help is maybe more efficient in the slow deliberative processing. So there's like, they're valued for different reasons. Both are praised in society, and some denigrate like the heroism as not helping as many people. So like economically, you know, like you're helping more people if you donate to a huge organization. But you have to understand the way people are motivated and still pull that into the deliberated effort. And then it was, how can altruism be trained, is a really good question that people ask a lot. So altruism, in the book, we describe how it's like not nature or nurture, but like the way you're raised and the environment that you're in shape this evolved process in all species, not just in humans. So there's like always this interaction between the environment you're in and how you're taught, and, you know, the way in which this empathy and altruism are drawn out in your life. At the extreme examples, you have people who are like, have psychopathy or psychopathic traits or sociopathic traits, who have very poor empathy. And they're usually not just in some genetic way different, but they're raised in very difficult environments, and they're not treated well. They are not given good role models and examples of loving, tender care. And so it actually does impact them for the long term. But on the other hand, you know, you can train people to be empathic and altruistic if you help them understand the situation of the other in a really embodied way, right? So that's what we're going to do next in our lab, is try to use narrative stories and visual and creative arts to let people in a really profoundly emotional way to the experience of someone different from them that they don't already understand. So like an out group or somebody who goes through something they've never experienced and promotes this urge despite the divide. So to kind of cross the divide through perspective taking in this really rich way that involves the true subjective experience of others. Lived life. So that's what we're going to try and do. And that's what we think is most likely to work.
So basically changing the perception of who is bringing people from out group to the in group.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
And I think you may have answered the next question, basically attributes, physical attributes, I guess, such as beauty, youth, health, frailty, as opposed to health. Like change our the drive to extend help to others.
Right. So with the model, if you assume you want to help something that's like a helpless newborn baby, then something that's attractive and cute and very vulnerable or weak seeming, but not weak in a sustained way, but just temporarily rendered weak by their situation, right? Like a baby is weak just because it's born helpless, right? But a boy who falls into the train track is weak temporarily because he suffered this neurological event. So there's different ways in which we can be rendered weak. And somebody who's elderly on the opposite side of the lifespan is rendered weak by their age, and it's not their fault. It's, something that they're vulnerable. So people want to help in those cases, but there's a distinction between beauty and cuteness where, like endangered species are majestic and beautiful, and we want to save them, but infants are cute. And even with human faces, we're attracted to cute ones, and cute ones are viewed as more beautiful. But there's also this concept of beauty that's more like adult romantic love that doesn't need to have so much of this childlike features. The fittest do not survive and the species does not benefit.
So like a devil's advocate, is it a cost, basically, if I read it, cost to altruism?
No. So this is maybe referring to E.O. Wilson, who was a famous ethologist, and actually we included some of his ant research in the book. But what we do is we take these features of evolutionary theory and we're strongly drawing upon the idea of inclusive fitness. So inclusive fitness means you share genes with the other individual. And so when you help them, genes that you share are propagated and more likely to survive in the gene pool. And you don't just share genes with your family, you share genes with, the human species and individuals who live on the same island as you. And, so there's many ways in which historically and evolutionarily we shared genes with people in our own social group, and especially in our own family, that like directly track the degree to which you want to help those individuals, which makes genetic sense. So altruism in theory makes no sense, because why would you hurt yourself to benefit another? But in practice, it actually is helpful and genetically viable, which is things like Trivers and Hamilton are famous for writing about these like genetic benefits to altruism.
Well, there is a question on, I guess this is the issue of the day, being pro-life activism. I guess the selling point is that they care about other people's kids, as it were. But do you see that genuine altruism can ever be conventional, or there is some sort of genuine altruism? If you can distinguish between made-up altruism and the genuine one.
Well, the way I see it is both sides of the debate involve this concern and care to protect the vulnerable, but the focus of attention is in a different spot, right? So in the case of the pro-life individuals, they have this really intense focus on the fetus, and the unborn to be born child. And that is to them like the definition of the most vulnerable individual, because, you know, it doesn't have any say in the choice to live or die. And it, you know, is dependent on the mother to provide good care and things like that. But in the case of pro-choice, I think there's this much different focus on the life of the mother and the child after the period of birth. So, for example, people point out like the hypocrisy of wanting to save babies, but not supporting, you know, welfare, healthcare, education, like all the daycare, all the features that are needed to actually support and prop up the raising of the individual to be healthy and successful and thriving. And so like there's the perception of vulnerability and need in both cases. It's just there's this really different focus of attention in the two cases. And I think the way in which we're polarized as a society turns up the volume on those differences by creating those echo chambers where, you know, everyone you know is only talking about one more than the other.
Well, there's a question about, I guess, sense of gratification, how fast it is. Basically, since helping the environment doesn't immediately cause you to benefit, but it's a long-term benefit for all. Do you see an effect to that?
There are so many ways in which climate change is a misfit for your brain. It's such an issue because most of the negative impacts of climate change occur in places where people are in poverty and not where the people are making the decisions or have the money to make the changes. They're very slow processes, so people can't see them as acute emergencies the way like your brain was designed for acute emergencies. Your brain was designed to actually perceive the distress directly. Like if you're crying, if you're screaming, if you're in pain, it's so immediate and physical to me that it drives this immediacy of the response. But, you know, right now I'm looking out my window and there's beautiful trees blooming and, you know, we had a sunny day yesterday and you think all is right with the world. And, you know, I don't live in Texas where they're having this constant flooding. I don't live in China where the water is so polluted from our plastics that they're trying to recycle, you know, and so it's just so distant from people. And so it can't create that motivation. But I think the question asker asked about reward, like there's no immediate reward, but there is in the sense of if you encourage people to experience nature, like going for walks in these parks and seeing the monarch butterflies be raised and going to, you know, zoos or eco parks and things like that. If people have these salient experiences, especially in early development, then they develop this sense of the habitat as being rewarding per se. And then it's valued and it's considered part of your self-concept, and then you want to save it. So like there is a sense in which reward can be embedded in it and promote giving. You just have to like foster opportunities to experience that reward. And for example, we have a published study where people can find psychological ownership over a natural place like a park that they don't own, but that they have a lot of experience in, and they feel like becomes part of their self-concept and they have ownership over it, and then they're more likely to want to save it. So we have a study on that.
Okay, so maybe this is kind of tangentially kind of related in a sense that you were talking about individual to individual relationship as opposed to individual to a group expanded in time. So this question basically asks a bigger sense of altruism as a society. For example, a leader could announce a justified war, and with that decision, I guess you know, hundreds of thousands or more people would die, but is for a cause, or a CEO who has to come and make corrections, change the direction of a company, and in that process terminate some employees. So do you see any difference between a sense of altruism for somebody who is at a leadership position?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, in the book, we talk about the fact that the altruistic urge isn't all or none, right? And you have competing goals, right? So you have your own personal goals or the goals for your company or for your nation that you're in charge of as a leader. And sometimes they conflict and sometimes they don't, right? And so when they conflict, then people have to make these like really careful decisions about how to go forth in order to like benefit all if possible, but the most valued target when push comes to shove is usually chosen. So, you know, there's small examples. Somebody asked about, you know, unhoused people on the street, let's say, and when people are in a hurry to get to class or they're late for a meeting, you know, or they really need those last couple dollars in their wallet for something, you know, that day, they're not going to help, right? And they have their competing goals that are very salient in their minds in the moment. And similarly, if you need to protect your in-group, like a leader might need to do, a chimpanzee might need to do, if you want to protect your social in-group, sometimes it requires not caring about the needs of others or, you know, even harming others, which is part of our evolved brain. You know, you can't ignore it as not existing. This isn't a Pollyanna approach. It's, you know, everybody's brain is designed to integrate these conflicts and these goals. And usually in a case like heroism or altruism in the moment, it's no cost to you. It's, you know, it's not really like impeding your life goals to like stop and give somebody the time or $1 or help them find their dog that got lost at the park. You know, like those are inconsequential for you in the long run, but sometimes, as you're saying, they are very consequential. And one thing I think is interesting about that is for the longest time, the CEO was viewed as making better decisions to the degree that they were like a little bit more cutthroat, right? And like bottom line. But because of social media and cancel culture and people's value of philanthropy and protecting vulnerable populations, sometimes lately it's benefiting corporations to be explicit about the ways in which they are being helpful, even maybe at a cost to the bottom line, which makes people value the company more, which can be beneficial in the long run.
So just to paraphrase, so it is possible to have a decision as altruistic at the individual level, but totally the opposite at the group level or vice versa.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Okay, so
Yeah.
there's another question on the statistics, basically seeing things, being desensitized, like this questioner asking about panhandlers on the street. You every day pass them by, you stop not looking at them. But if you haven't done this, if you're from outside and coming in, you probably be more affected. Or something that Stalin mentioned, one death is tragedies, I think is attributed to him. But you know, millions are only statistics. Do you see any impact of statistics on altruism?
Right. No, I think that's like an important consideration. And so we talk about examples like this in the book, where one example would be the one I gave, where if you have competing goals, like you're concerned about money or time, you know, you don't help these individuals. But also, like, remember, the rat mothers did not habituate to the pups. They just continued to carry and carry and carry, which is the opposite of what we see like in an urban environment. Like, I'm from DC myself, and there were homeless people on the street, and it's alarming at first. And then you're like, oh, they're still there, you know? And so the continued chronic presence of the people in need makes you not categorize them anymore as vulnerable or their need being acute. So now it's a chronic problem, and you're not as strongly motivated by chronic need as by urgent need. And so even though they might literally need your aid today to eat, to get a warm shelter, you know, in Michigan, it's a very serious problem to be on the street in wintertime. You know, but you habituate to this if it appears chronic. And again, we talk about this a lot in my class recently, where people are attributing responsibility to these individuals, like, well, you're a bad person, you're just going to buy drugs, this is your fault, why don't you get a job, you know? Like, so there's this rhetoric around demonizing the individual. And I think if you know more about the situation, like we talked about perspective taking, you wouldn't be as likely to see it that way. Like these people all have difficult lived experiences, and their homes and their lives are not like yours. It's not a meritocracy, right? But we don't know that. We need to learn more about what their lives are like throughout their life. But you are more likely to help if you know more about this situation. And sometimes the demonizing is self-rationalizing. Somebody mentioned guilt. And so you don't have to feel guilt for having passed up somebody who looked in need if you're able to recast them as like the devil, rather than the innocent victim. And so some of it is like post hoc rationalizing so that you don't walk around feeling terrible because you feel like you just can't help everyone.
Here's a question. People are, I guess, left-brained or right-brained, I guess more analytic or holistic. Is empathy, do you see in your studies that empathy and its strength is related to that?
Actually, I would say yes. I'm not sure I'm willing to say left or right, but people who are more engaged emotionally in the people around them, like we saw the concept of being impassive toward the earth, and actually being related to being less emotional overall and less emotional toward even people in need or animals in need, less emotional about positive events. So the degree to which you're emotionally involved in your environment and your situation, and you're permissive of feeling emotions, you're more likely to want to help. And if you are strongly rationalizing, you can kind of suppress these emotional feelings and be more likely to carry through on your personal goals. So I do think they can counteract one another. But on the other hand, a person can use these emotional states to inform a very deliberate cognitive decision to help a lot of people. So they're not necessarily in conflict, but you do need to be willing to look at people in need and not be afraid or avoidant of those potentially uncomfortable feelings.
Okay. Well, here's a question. Again, I think you answered the part about basically the questioner asks about abortion debate, how the anger impacts somebody's willingness to take immediate action. But the second part, I think, if you want to expand on gender differences as well.
Oh yeah, I forgot that one. As I mentioned earlier, we always see more aid in women. The only exception is what they call that physical heroism is more common in males, or at least it's more reported in males. So if you look at the winners of the Carnegie Medal of Heroism, it's interesting, a lot of those are posthumous awards. So somebody sometimes does put themselves in risk and doesn't survive, and so we honor them as heroes. But a lot of times they do survive, and more of those are men. But in other fields where you can give, it's equal or more for women, and in experiments in the lab, it's always higher for women.
Okay. Actually, I attest to the fact that when we had an event a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, on immigration and refugee crisis, 90% of our audience were female, and which was clearly observed. And the few men actually were complaining about resources. So I don't know if you read too much. So here's a question: because poorer people are often more generous. It's true, but you can expand on it. And willing to help others than wealthier folks, and challenged or judge persons with disabilities or LGBTQ. Did you compare responses of these groups to solicitations and appeals?
Yeah, I think that's an awesome point. And there is research on this in multiple ways. So on the one hand, they do find that if you prime people to think about wealth or power, or people are in positions of wealth or power, they're less likely to be compassionate or empathic because I think they become their mindset gets shifted toward this sense of dominance. So they have, for example, a scale called the social dominance orientation. And somebody very high on social dominance orientation feels more powerful than others and derives value from that feeling. And so, you know, feeling tender-hearted seems like in conflict to that drive. And so that there's less altruism in that case. But also why people in poverty might be more likely to give. We mentioned perspective taking. So we do research on this concept of meritocracy, where when you grow up in privilege, you don't understand what the life is like for somebody who doesn't have privilege. So you think you earned everything you have, and therefore it's more likely that the homeless person or the person in poverty must just not have worked hard, because surely I worked hard and got everything I deserved. And it's invisible to you, the degree to which you had these social supports. But then somebody in poverty, you know, didn't have all these privileges, but it's very salient to them why people struggle, because they struggle. People around them struggle. People in their families struggle. So it's easier for them to identify with this. And there's some talk about this in the book about poverty and scarcity, where they talk about you can be in this scarcity mindset, and people in poverty are more likely to be in this scarcity mindset where you're constantly worrying about where the next money is going to come from. And when the money comes in, they don't put it in a bank account. They give it to the relative who just had a problem, or the neighbor whose car broke down, or the cousin who needs to be bailed out, or someone who needs food. You know, they're more likely to keep the money in circulation in the community than save it in a bank, which, you know, privileged white economists think is irrational. Like, why aren't they saving their money? That's so irrational. But they're in a completely different context and need to be understood in that context. Okay. So I think it all makes sense.
Right. I just want to add that one of the most famous philanthropists is the richest man also, Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if it's always true that, you know, wealthier people are less impactful, at least, right? I mean,
well, that's like the story. I don't know if you know the story in the Bible of, you know, they said that the woman who was poor and gave everything is going to go into heaven, more so maybe than the wealthier person who actually gave more money. And people find this story very frustrating. Right? But it's like Rockefeller didn't need all that money, and he still got to live in, you know, like a mansion, and had multiple of these mansions. So it didn't like impact his life in the same way. And right. Now people have tax breaks for donation, and it actually benefits them. So there's all these different reasons, and it's okay. We love all giving. Okay. All giving is good. Okay.
Maybe I ask a quick my own question. Like United States is famous for you know, highest, I think, if I'm not mistaken, most philanthropic donation. Mm-hmm. While you know, considering the ACA and how difficult it is, you know, half the country were opposed to a public healthcare system, while Europe has this. Do you see any cultural differences overriding? You know, why is it so different between us and
right? So America is like a country of immigrants who like came to some place to strike out, right? Like, so the American dream is that like you as an individual strike out and, you know, rise through the ranks and succeed, and then you have money and prestige. And so like our culture in America is defined by this sense of what they call individualism, where your thoughts are more oriented toward the individual. And so the same with the meritocracy, right? Like you think I should succeed and it's my work that will lead to the success, right? So we're constantly thinking about like the rights of the individual over everything else, right? And in the gun lobby, this comes up also. In COVID, this comes up, right? Like the rights of the individual are more important than the welfare to the greater good. But in at least in European countries, they have this kind of baked in historical sense of not socialism, but like the greater good of society, and where we all have to be propped up through this bigger system. And they call that collectivism. So like your mind is more oriented toward helping the collective and the success of the group. So they have demonstrated these differences in culture. And I think it underlies a lot of this so Americans pat themselves on the back for being the most philanthropic in terms of individual donation, but a lot of that, you know, is required to support people in a system that has no built-in support.
Sure.
So it's kind of just like the work's being offloaded to the individual donations.
Okay. Well, we have quite a few questions. I'm going to go through as much as we can. Susan Fitzgibbon asks or comments that she loves the brain diagrams that show what you're studying. Do you have more examples? Are there many in the book?
Yeah, I can kind of go through some of these questions quickly. The diagrams that I showed were in the book. I did the drawings, and my daughter did one of the drawings, and one is a painting from my husband's grandmother. So those are in the book. And the research articles have the actual images of the brains. And there's a few more pictures of brains in the book. Yeah, but definitely that's in the book. And we do hope our research is able to inform discrimination and racism, and that's kind of like our next wave of studies that are in process right now, and how to teach people, you know, perspective taking and evidence-based reasoning and things like that to ameliorate these effects. So we are working on that. And I really like Heather Jacobs' comment about these waves of altruism. So yeah, Americans can be wrapped up in a moment, and they give, you know, like, for example, we all drove to DC, whether we lived in DC or not, for this women's march, you know, a few years ago. And then some people sustain their effort for like a few months, 6 months, but then it sort of like all died down, and then nobody cared anymore, right? And so I do think people tire and they habituate, and they can be driven in the moment. Like when Haiti had a hurricane, Americans donated so much money so quickly that they couldn't even figure out what to do with it, right? And so like these images on the news of these people after the situation, they had this urge, right? But nobody's following up later and trying to figure it out. So I do think that's a really good fit for the model. And this is the humanitarian crisis. Oh, are refugees more empathic? That's an interesting case, actually, because it can go two ways, right? So there's perspective taking, like I know what their life was like. I feel it. I'm empathic. I have experience with something like that. So those all sound like good things, right? But there's also another phenomenon in this same area, like the just me, like I made it into America. I made it successful, even though I was an immigrant or I was a refugee. And so you should too. So this idea of the false belief that you worked for your efforts and therefore anyone in need isn't working as hard as you leads to issues. So sometimes there's actually less giving because you're like, why aren't they doing as well as me? I made it through. Online bullying. Yeah, I think this is so important. So somebody asked about social media and the internet and altruism and the degree to which bullying can happen. So we talked earlier about the way your brain is designed to observe immediate direct distress from an individual in pain. So I can't feel your pain, and not very well, at least, unless I see your pain. I can imagine it in my mind, but it's not nearly as powerful. So if you're on social media, you're, reacting quickly and thinking only of yourself, and you're in this highly individualistic mode or this like group protection mode, and you can demonize another person and never have to see them cry at home. Like, you don't know, like this is not an important example, but teaching ratings are like this. So students don't actually think of teachers as like humans with feelings. They just think of them as like annoying taskmasters. And so the things sometimes people will write in teaching evaluations, not mine, of course, but other people's, is like horrible. And you're like, do you know that these people are like crying at home and like getting fired from their jobs because of something you like wrote in the middle of the night after you're mad about your test, And so I do think that is a very important problem. And it would be awesome if we could think of some ways to ameliorate that, because this online bullying is tragic, has tragic consequences sometimes.
One last question.
Yeah, this is a good question about if you've been in the recession or the pandemic, are you going to be more empathic toward people who, you know, had poverty or lost something, or nurses or people in nursing homes? So this gets back to this idea of like things that you have experienced are more familiar to you. Your brain already has these laid tracks for those emotions and those concepts that are very rich and embodied in your mind. They're not abstract concepts at that point. They're like real to you and they're physical. So we have brain imaging studies actually showing this, that you can imagine somebody else's emotional state and activate sort of the same brain areas. But when you've had that experience, it's much more intense, and you have this, you know, sweat on your palms and your heart races and your face muscles change. And so it's much more of an emotional response if you've had something similar. But, you know, nurses have burnout, for example. So this habituation that we talked about with the unhomed individual is real. It's very serious in some of these cases. So they worry a lot about, for example, doctors and nurses having burnout, and then they can't bring themselves to care anymore. And I think we have to find ways to balance this aid to others and make these jobs rewarding in many ways, and that they are not currently. Like people in nursing, and especially like home healthcare nursing homes, they're not paid well for like the type and the difficulty of work that they're doing. So we need to make those rewarding jobs where the experience of the person is valued at a higher level. And I had one other thing related to that I wanted to share about the pandemic and burnout. Oh, I know. My husband works in the residency program at Wayne State University. And so these are people who during the pandemic, they had just become doctors, and then they were just like slammed with this completely unusual and tragic situation. People are working around the clock. They're seeing, you know, dozens more people die per day than would be normal. And, you know, they actually said that they felt value in their degree and in their helping initially, because, you know, it felt good to have an outlet for this care and concern. And they actually liked the helping, which is like the altruistic urge. But then at least one person described crying and having this emotional breakdown when they realized they didn't get emotional when somebody died. So they got so habituated to this death cycle and so fatigued that at one point they lost this sense of care and concern and upset when somebody died, and that felt tragic to them.
Well, thank you so much. I think we managed all the questions ran over time. I apologize to you for your time. But thank you so much. This has been educational. Any last comments before we close it? I just want to quickly mention that we recorded this, so we're gonna share this for people to view offline within 24 hours.
Well, I so appreciate the opportunity, and thank you so much for organizing, and thank you for all the people who showed up. And if you watch it online later, I'm also grateful. I think it's very important to talk about these things, even the uncomfortable ones. And you are welcome to email me. My email is prestos@umich.edu. I think I can put it here in the chat. And
we can share it with people.
Yeah, and I'm also, I have a work account on Facebook, Prof. Prestos, where you get all the updates about work, you know, not personal life stuff. So you're welcome to engage with me.
Well, thank you so much. Looking forward to your next book.
Thank you so much. I had a great time. Have a great night.